So let me introduce our speaker today. I think, this is a great, Bill's a great speaker for this topic, obviously, because this is his area of specialty. But he is very distinguished teaching now at Boston University, got his undergrad from Stanford, master's and doctoral degrees from Columbia, and then he has been working in this same area, World War II and the Cold War, for many years, authored many books and chapters of books on history, and he's got so many awards. I won't take up the rest of our time, talking about all of them, but a bunch of not only fellowships but awards as well. So suffice it to say that he is an excellent lecturer and with a specialty in what we're going to hear about. Bill, I'm going to just turn it over to you, and I'll try to kind of moderate questions, but feel free to open up whenever you'd like. And I'll remind everybody, if you want to click into the link so that you can see his slides, because he does have slides as well.
Okay, well, it's my pleasure to be in touch with all of you guys. It sounds like a good group. And what I thought I would do, if with your permission, is to give you a little background to the situation in Berlin in particular, but in Germany in general, for World War II. And so I am actually going to go back to the date in which Germany was created for the first time. There was no Germany before January of 1871, when as a result of the Franco-Prussian War, the individual states of Germany joined together to create the German Empire. First slide. So if you can see what I'm seeing, this is Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Prussia and then becomes the Chancellor of a united Germany. And when Germany united in 1871, it automatically and immediately became the most powerful country in Europe. Slide, please. So here's a map of the German Empire, and you can see the various individual states that had been independent and now are subsumed under the German Empire, or Reich is the term that the Germans use for empire. And about 18 years after the unification of Germany, another important event occurs. Next slide, please. And that is that Germany gets a new emperor, Kaiser Bill II, or Wilhelm II, and he is a member of the House of Hohenzollern, and he is going to try to expand Germany beyond Europe. Up to that time, Germany really was pretty much confined to Europe, and he wants to institute what he calls a Weltpolitik, or a world policy, and that is going to get him into trouble, particularly with Great Britain, but also France. Next slide, please. So here is a map of Europe in 1914, and you can see that Germany is surrounded on the two edges by France and the Russian Empire, and Great Britain right nearby there, and those are the three countries that are going to go to war with Germany and its allies. And World War I was the most bloody conflict that Europe had experienced in recent memory, and the United States intervenes in in 1917, and then finally in November of 1918 the war comes to an end. Germany has been defeated. Next slide, please. So let's go to the next slide right after this. There it is, yeah. The armistice is signed on November 11th, 1918, and we still celebrate that date. Nobody remembers World War I, but the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of that year. So Germany is going to be converted from a monarchy or an empire to a republic. The Kaiser is going to be overthrown, and he slinks into exile in Holland, and Germany is going to have a democratic or republican form of government. But there's another possibility at the end of World War I and the beginning of 1919, and that is there are a group of German communists who are going to try to emulate what the Bolsheviks had successfully brought off in Russia and to create a red republic. And you can see Rosa Luxemburg, who was the leader of this. They call themselves socialists, but they're soon going to be called communists. Karl Liebknecht is her right-hand man there. And the result of that is there is an uprising in Berlin in 1919 where the Bolsheviks try to take power. Next slide. The result of that is that the Republic has got to call on the army to bail it out because there's a communist revolution going on, and the German army crushes the Spartacists, as they call themselves. And so Germany is now going to be a moderate republic, not a red republic. Next slide, please. During this period, 1919, from January to June of 1919, the peace conference that is going to bring this war to an end is held in Paris. And you see here the big four. David Lloyd George on the left, he's the British Prime Minister. Vittorio Orlando, he represents Italy. Georges Clemenceau with a big walrus mustache. And our own Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States. And these guys are going to meet during this long period in order to draft a peace treaty. Next slide, please. So this is the outcome of those negotiations. And as you can see from the map, Germany has lost a significant amount of territory in the west. The Rhineland is going to be an independently operated region, and on the right you can see that territory that is ceded to Poland, including the city of Danzig, which becomes Gdansk in Poland, and that is a source of tremendous anger and resentment on the part of the Germans. I could also talk about the problem of reparations, but I'm going to skip across that, but just make the point here that Germany was expected to pay the costs of rebuilding the territory that their armies ravaged during this war. Next slide, please. So the peace treaty is submitted to the German delegation. They're asked to sign on the dotted line. They are not participants at all. They're not going to negotiate. And the result is what is called the Treaty of Versailles, because it was signed in the Royal Palace of Versailles. The actual meeting will be held in Paris. Next slide, please. So Germany becomes a democratic society. It's called the Weimar Republic because the Constitution was set up in the city of Weimar, which is a central German city. And the first president of the German Republic, or the Weimar Republic, is this man, Friedrich Ebert, and he is a socialist. So we went from a right-wing sort of militaristic empire to a socialist republic. He's a moderate socialist, not a Bolshevik. Next slide, please. So one of the points I'd like to make about this period of the interwar, 1920s up to 1933, is that there is really an explosion of what I call social experimentation. Wine, women, and song, as one person put it. Gay people were allowed to operate above board, and women had been given the right to vote, and they were very active in the political scene as well as in the social scene. Next slide, please. And you may have seen the play Cabaret, which I think perfectly captures this atmosphere of no holds barred, freewheeling. We can do anything we want now that we no longer have this oppressive government. And that continues right up to 1933. Next slide, please. Also worth mentioning is what I call the cultural renaissance in Germany. Here's just a list of some of the most important examples of the flowering of German culture in the 20s and early 30s. The Bauhaus architectural system, Martin Heidegger, one of the great philosophers of existentialism, Werner Heisenberg, one of the great physicists, art, expressionist art, the German film industry really takes off too. Marlene Dietrich is the sort of best known, but there are a lot of other ones. And of course, Albert Einstein, who is going to revolutionize the theories of physics. Next slide, please. Now, that's the one side. There's a dark side as well, and that is that the old order, represented by the man here with the spiked helmet, Erich Ludendorff, who was second in command of the German army during World War I, he and Adolf Hitler, a young, unknown fellow, are going to try to overthrow the government. And as a result, they are arrested. Ludendorff is let go because he is a sort of an icon, but Hitler is jailed briefly, and it's during that period that he writes his memoirs, Mein Kampf. Next slide, please. So in 1925, a couple of years after the so-called beer hall putsch, they hold an election after President Ebert dies, and who wins that election but none other than the retired Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg. Hindenburg is the Germany of the past, a loyal servant of the old empire, and yet the people of Germany elect him. So this is beginning to seem as though this republic is not going to be very successful with this kind of guy in charge. And then if we fast forward to the 1929-1930 period, the Great Depression hits Germany and hits it very hard. Massive unemployment, 25% of people out of work. And so essentially, next slide please, the man who everybody sort of joked about and didn't take seriously, Adolf Hitler, is going to be brought into the government. Originally, he's a member of it's a coalition government, but he gets rid of all of the other people there, and he is going to establish a one-party state. He's going to abolish all political parties, and he's going to crack down on the press, and he is going to pursue in the 1930s an effort to destroy the Versailles Treaty. And his whole basis of that is the principle of national self-determination, which he stole from Woodrow Wilson. And so that means wherever German people live, they have a right to be part of Germany. So he is going to annex Austria, which was an independent republic, in 1938. Later on in that year, he's going to annex the Sudetenland, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. And then finally, next slide, please. He is going to demand that Poland give up control of the city of Danzig and the area, the so-called Polish corridor that led to Danzig, and that's the beginning of World War II, when Britain and France come into the war a couple of days after that. Hitler is well on his way to succeeding everything that he had hoped. Now, I'm going very quickly here. Next slide, please. But after the fall of France in the early summer of 1940 and the failure of the Battle of Britain, where Germany tried to bomb Britain into submission, the Battle of Britain as it's called, the Blitz as the British call it, in June of 1941, Hitler is going to invade the Soviet Union. And you can see from the map here, It's essentially a three-pronged attack, and the central armored front is going to be going straight to Moscow. That's Napoleon's old road
Oh,
to
you
Moscow.
want speed?
Huh? What did you say?
Yeah, we have some on the line. If you could, again, remember to mute your phone, please.
Okay. All right. So the invasion of the Soviet Union is a failure. And after a couple of years, the Red Army is driving the Germans out of the Soviet Union and is approaching Berlin. Next slide, please. And of course, on the 6th of June, 1944, the British and the Americans and the Canadians are going to land in northern France, in Normandy, to open a second front. So now the Germans have to confront with the Red Army coming from the east and the British and the Americans, who are going to eventually liberate France and then approach Germany from the west. Next slide, please. And I came across this cartoon which perfectly summarizes, I think, the problem that Hitler faces in Berlin. You've got the Russian bear on the right there with his claws moving into Germany, and on the western part of Germany you have this massive bombardment campaign by the Americans and the British. They are bombing virtually every major city of Germany, and so Hitler is finally facing the end of the line here. Next slide, please. Now, Hitler was ensconced in a bunker, the Führer bunker as it was called, in Berlin, and as the Russians are literally ready to go into that bunker on April 30th, 1945, he holds a very hasty wedding ceremony with his longtime lover, Eva Braun, and then they both kill themselves. They both commit suicide. He knows that the game is up. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the Hitler bunker. You can see the destruction that was wreaked there. Next slide, please. But if you try to find the Hitler bunker today, you won't find it. It's been covered over. Here is where it's located. There are no plaques. There is nothing to attract, pro-Nazi people there. So it's an unknown quantity here. Although I think with a good guide, the guide will take you to where it was located. Next slide, please. So a few days, about a week after Hitler's suicide, the war ends in Europe, and the actual surrender is going to take place in Reims, France. That's where General Eisenhower is located, and it is going to be an unconditional surrender. No negotiations like the last time around. Eisenhower is simply going to demand a total unconditional surrender. Next slide, please. The Russians don't want to let it go at that. They insist on having their own ceremony, which is going to take place in Berlin. They have occupied Berlin, and so there is a second signing ceremony, and the Russians still celebrate VE Day 2 days after Americans do because of this separate signing ceremony. Next slide, please. A few words about the destruction of German cities, and I've been talking about Berlin this whole time. I haven't said anything about Dresden, and I'm going to mention Dresden in two of these slides here. The first is that the British are going to unleash the most destructive bombing campaign of the entire war on the city of Dresden. It's not a military target. It was full of civilians, most of them refugees, and yet the British are going to just bomb the hell out of it. And you can see that at least 100,000 civilians died, which is about almost double the number of civilians that died in Britain during Blitz, during the German attack on Britain. Next slide, please. So when you get to Berlin, you're going to see this rather strange building here. What it is, Kaiser Wilhelm Kirche it's called. It was kept as it was in 1945. That is, the destruction, the bombing of the old church is there for you to see, and it's right in the middle of a very modern part of Berlin, and it's sort of a reminder of this extraordinary loss of life and loss of buildings and so forth as a result of this bombing campaign. I mentioned the British bombing Dresden. The Americans are also bombing very heavily there as well. Next slide, please. So the decision is made at the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin meet in the Crimean Peninsula, and the decision is made to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. There's not going to be a German government the way there was the last time around. Germany is going to be occupied by these 4 powers. The French essentially get the Rhineland, the British the northern part, the Americans Bavaria and the southern part, and the Russians, of course, get Berlin and Prussia and all of the eastern part. So that decision is going to be put into operation once the war comes to an end in the spring of 1945. Next slide, please.
Hey, Bill, would you mind commenting about Dresden and why did they choose Dresden to base it?
Yes. There's no logical reason they did. Arthur Harris, Bomber Harris, as he was called, the British commander here, just decides that they were going to hit big cities. Hamburg is another example I could have mentioned. It was bombed back to the Stone Age. Cologne in the Rhineland. It's just hit the big cities. And so, again, nothing to do with military strategy. It was essentially intended to stampede the population into forcing a surrender. It's sort of a psychological motivation for strategic bombing, as it was called. Again, no military targets, just big cities to kill as many people, to demonstrate to the enemy that it's time to give up. Okay, so here are the 4 zones you can see with their respective flags there. And what's going to happen between 1946 and 48 is that the 3 western zones, the democratic or capitalist zones, the British, American, and French zones, are going to decide to merge. The British and the Americans are first. They merge in 1946, and then finally in 1948, the French are going to join up. So you've got 3 former zones becoming a single zone, and that means a single economy. It means a single political system because they start setting up municipal governments and so forth. And the Russians, of course, are still in the Soviet zone. So this is really the beginning or the source of the division of Germany into 2 rather than into 4. Next slide, please. So the anomaly of Berlin, when they set up this occupation, Berlin was decided that's where the occupation force is going to be run. They're going to really show the Germans that they have lost by setting up shop in their capital city. Well, unfortunately for the West, Berlin is about 110 miles within the Soviet zone of occupation, and you can see in the map on the right there that the city of Berlin itself was divided into 4 occupation sectors, as they were called. The Soviet, American, British, and French sectors. Well, it didn't work very well. It was very, very difficult, particularly with the advent of the Cold War, because these four powers are no longer allies. The three Western powers are adversaries of the Soviet Union, and yet you still have this anomaly of Berlin. And so finally Stalin decides, we've got to put a stop to this. This is ridiculous that we're allowing these imperialist, capitalist pigs to come into Berlin and to march around and so forth. And so he decides in 1948 to close it down, to shut it off. And he uses as a pretext for that when the three Western zones decide to set up an independent German currency. There was no money. Literally, cigarettes were the major source of currency there. And so the three Western powers say, okay, we're going to create a single German currency. We're going to call it the Deutschmark. And he uses this as a pretext for, next slide please, for blocking access of the three Western powers to Berlin. And that means not only the Autobahn, not only the roads, but the canals and anything else. Going to keep them out of Berlin. And the point here is he's trying to starve what we can now call West Berlin, the three Western zones of Berlin, into submission. And hopefully, from his point of view, to expel the three Western powers from Berlin. Next slide, please. Here's a cartoon I found that really demonstrates it very well. It's a chess game. Stalin and Truman are trying to decide what we're going to do about this. And Truman, of course, is concerned that if the situation continues, that the people of West Berlin will be starved and they won't have any fuel, because all of that comes from the three Western sectors. And so the decision is made not to send an army into Berlin, but rather, next slide please, to organize an airlift. And the Berlin airlift continues from 1948, 1949, mainly the British and the Americans, and they are going to bring food and fuel to the people of West Berlin. Next slide, please. The Berlin airlift is a complete success. Absolutely, totally successful. They bring enough food, they bring enough gasoline and so forth, and so the people of West Berlin are able to survive. The Russians might possibly have tried to shoot down those planes, but remember, the United States has a monopoly on nuclear weapons. It's the only one that has them, so maybe that has something to do with dissuading them from doing it. So finally, next slide, please. Oh, I forgot I had this one too. Yeah, here's a nice propaganda poster for Douglas aircraft. They're able to essentially say that we're saving the people of Berlin. You can't read it, it's too short, too small print, but it says, Berliners sample a new way of life. So the Berlin airlift is really seen as a tremendous psychological victory for the West. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most famous pilot is Colonel Halverson, the so-called candy bomber. He would drop parachutes with chocolate goodies to the people of Berlin, the children of Berlin, and they loved it, of course, and again, a great propaganda victory for the West. Next slide, please. There was some resistance on the part of some people I don't know if you can read the slide there, but it says, "Seems to me as if I've seen him somewhere before." Here's Hitler taking some flour from the airlift. That is, why are we helping these people out after the terrible things that they did to us? So it wasn't all 100% sort of celebration of Germany, but there was some pushback. Next slide, please. So finally, in the spring of 1949, Stalin recognizes the jig is up, so he calls off the blockade. He announces that the road work that was being done on the highways has been completed, and so now we can allow the trucks and so forth to come through. That was a complete total nonsense. Now, the immediate outcome of this Berlin blockade, next slide please, is of course the division of Germany into two. The British, American, and French zones are going to be amalgamated politically into the Federal Republic of Germany, or West Germany as it's usually called, and the Soviet Union is going to establish in their zone the German Democratic Republic, ironically called, or East Germany. So now this is the height of the Cold War, and Germany has been divided into two. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to move along very quickly. I see I'm running out of time, but I want to get on to the rest of the story here. Berlin continues to be a problem. Continues to be a problem throughout the 1950s and into the early 60s. And basically what happens once Mr. Khrushchev takes power in the Kremlin, he is going to try to get the Americans and the British and the French out of Berlin. And the way that he proposes to do that is to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany, allowing East Germany to take control of its borders, its access to and from East Berlin. And so Khrushchev really puts the screws on. First Eisenhower, and then he meets with Kennedy in Vienna, June of 1961, the first and only time they meet, and he just whacks Kennedy over the head with a hammer. He just absolutely, this is a photo op we're seeing here, but when they got away from the cameras, they really went at it, and so it looked as though maybe Berlin might be the cause of World War III. I'm not exaggerating. This is when fallout shelters are being built and the duck and cover drills and all the rest. Next slide, please. So the issue here is access to West Berlin, and this is basically problem number one for East Germany and East Berlin. That is, you've got these Western forces having the right to cross East German territory. Imagine if you were Walter Ulbricht, the Communist Party boss of East Germany, and you saw British and American and French trucks going across your territory into West Berlin, a tremendous source of humiliation and embarrassment. Next slide, please. The other problem that Ulbricht faced was the brain drain. Remember, Berlin is a single city, and if you live in East Berlin and you decide that you want to check out West Berlin, all you have to do is take your car or the U-Bahn, the metro, or what have you, and go to West Berlin. And what do you see? You see a very prosperous society. And you walk down the Kudamm, the Kurfürstendamm, which is the sort of Fifth Avenue of West Berlin, and they have all the highest, the latest French fashions, the latest gadgets and so forth, all of these consumer goods, and then you go back to your little drab apartment in East Berlin, and you basically say, I'm out of here. And so more and more East Berliners are going across and then getting into the airplane and emigrating, most of them, almost all of them, to West Germany. So Ulbricht, again, is going to put tremendous pressure on Khrushchev to do something about this. Halt the brain drain. Next slide, please. And finally, Khrushchev does. On August 13th, 1961, he orders the closure of the border between East Berlin and West Berlin. There's a Brandenburg Gate in the background there. Next slide, please. And then they call in the cement mixers, and they are going to construct what comes to be known, next slide, as the most famous or infamous wall in Europe, the Berlin Wall. And the Berlin Wall solves the brain drain. It is very difficult to get across after the wall is constructed. So that problem was solved. Next slide, please. And you can see in the yellow there, that's where the wall meanders across. And there are a number of checkpoints. And the only way that you can get either way is by going through that checkpoint. If you're an East Berliner, no way in the world are you going to be allowed to go through that checkpoint. The Americans and the British and the French still have the right to circulate within the Soviet sector. They have to go through the checkpoint to do that. Next one, please. Now, there is a brief period when it looks as though this Berlin Wall might have led to World War III. General Lucius Clay, who was the Truman's man in Germany during the period after World War II, he was the High Commissioner, goes back to Berlin as a sort of symbol. We're with you. And what happens is that the Americans demand the right to go across, because this is written into the Potsdam Agreement, and we have a perfect right to go into East Berlin. Next slide, please. And so there is a showdown. This is at the famous checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, and this is the first time, really, that American and Soviet tanks are facing each other. It doesn't lead to war, and finally the Khrushchev backs down and Ulbricht backs down and allows the three Western powers to have access to East Berlin, and that prevents a war. Next slide, please. So I said that it cured the brain drain. There are a few people that were able to escape. You can see the map here: East Berlin on the left, West Berlin on the right. There's a no man's land in between, and every once in a while somebody will be able to get across. I think there was one guy that there was a fake trunk or something in his car, and he drove across. And there was one famous example. This, by the way, if you get to Checkpoint Charlie, you can see a wonderful museum there that depicts this. A family got into a balloon and went over into West Germany. So there were a few examples, but by and large, the Berlin problem was solved. The Berlin brain drain, if you will, is solved. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward because the Berlin issue is no longer an issue after this. It's not on the radar of the leadership. And so what I'm going to do is fast forward to the end of the 1980s, and here we see Leipzig. I haven't talked about Leipzig much. Remember, Leipzig was bombed by the British during the war. Well, the first overt expression of dissent in East Germany is going to come on the streets of Leipzig, where the people go into the street and they demand that the communist government end its control. And this is the first in a series of uprisings in East Germany. And finally, November 9th, 1989, the communist leaders of East Germany abolished travel restrictions to the West for the first time. So now if you are a citizen of East or West Berlin, you can go see the other side. And of course, this is usually referred to as the fall of the Berlin Wall. It didn't actually fall. It was just opened so that people could go through it. Next slide, please. I'm sure that many of you have seen these photos, and it is just a huge public celebration of the opening of the Berlin Wall. Next slide, please. Really some quite extraordinary pictures here of East German border guards not being able to do anything to prevent this attack on the Berlin Wall, the symbol of the Cold War. Now, after the opening of the Berlin Wall, what is going to happen in East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic, is that the communist government there is overthrown peacefully. And a non-communist government comes into control. Well, now you have a non-communist government in East Germany and a non-communist government in West Germany. The only reason that there was an East Germany and West Germany is ideological. That is, one was communist and the other was capitalist democratic, and now they are essentially the same. So people begin to scratch their heads and say, well, what's the point of continuing to have two Germanys when the two Germanys are so similar? Next slide. So Helmut Kohl, who is a Christian Democrat and the leader of West Germany, is going to set in motion a process which is going to lead to German reunification. It isn't easy, and there's a lot of pushback. Mr. Gorbachev in the Soviet Union is very unhappy about the prospect of united Germany. There's pushback from France and even from Great Britain. Margaret Thatcher is really upset about the prospect of united Germany. Look what we've had from 1871 to 1945. We've had a united Germany, and look what it produced. So they're worried that this united Germany will dominate Europe, will control Europe. But President George H.W. Bush was all in favor of it, and so he supports Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and so Germany is going to be reunited in 1991. Finally, this is my last slide. When you get to Berlin, if you do visit Checkpoint Charlie, you're going to see a lot of fake stuff. These are actors who are pretending as though the American and the Russian would be standing next to each other there to entertain you, and so forth. And again, to repeat what I said earlier, if you get a chance to go to Checkpoint Charlie, see that wonderful museum, which displays in video form so much of what I've talked about this afternoon. That's the end of my formal lecture. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Okay, open it up for questions.
I have one. Going back a little further, you mentioned that Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide in a specific location, which is now ruined.
Yeah.
I actually have two questions. Where did their bodies go? And then the second question is, in Dresden, you mentioned the British bombing, and weren't the Americans and the Allied forces responsible for that? I'm a little confused there.
Yeah, to your first question, after the suicide of Hitler and Eva Braun, his basically set them on fire and cremated them. Not completely. It wasn't a complete success, but there's no evidence. By the way, you probably have heard this old conspiracy theory that Hitler actually escaped and went to Argentina. No way. No way. There is absolutely irrefutable evidence that he died in that bunker. On the question of Dresden, it was sort of a division of labor here. The British are bombing Dresden. The Americans are bombing Cologne and Hamburg. So they're working in tandem, and they're both very, very successful at completely destroying those respective cities. I might add that at the end, I'm going to go on a little further with this, at the end of the war, the U.S. government sponsored the so-called Strategic Bombing Survey, which interviewed all the people involved on all sides, and the conclusion they came to was that the strategic bombing of these German cities did not in any way shorten the war. It had virtually no impact on the war. And so, strategic bombing is not very successful. We saw that in Vietnam. It just does not have the psychological impact that its sponsors thought it would be, that the people would rise up against their government. On the contrary, it seems that it strengthens the government.
Thanks. Somebody else had a question. I think.
You're not hurting my feelings. That means that my lecture was so perfect that there are no questions.
Well, I started to say that, actually. This was an excellent presentation.
Well, thank you.
I'll ask one, which may seem very naive, but I don't remember why it got the name Cold War.
Okay. This is a term that was first publicized. It wasn't the first time it was used, but it actually was in public, is in 1947 when the journalist Walter Lippmann writes a book called The Cold War. And what he meant by that was, we're no longer at war, but this isn't really peace. It's somewhere in between war and peace, and so he called it the Cold War. As I said, he wasn't the one that coined the term. It was used by people earlier, but that's the origin of the term when it was used publicly.
Okay, thanks.
I have a question. How and exactly when did so many German officers get out of Germany and get to South America and other places?
Yeah. An interesting question. Not only German officers, but there were some collaborators of Hitler, like Adolf Eichmann, who were able to go underground, to change their appearance, and to blend into the population, I guess you would say. And then they eventually, I'm thinking of a couple of examples of this, one of them gets to Italy, and then Argentina was the major recipient of these former Nazi officers and civilians, but other South American countries as well. And I guess another point to make is that the end of the war, of course, as you know, the Germans never developed an atomic bomb, but they had scientists who were perfectly capable of doing that. And so at the end of the war, the Russians in their area are going to pick up the German physicists, the German scientists, and they're going to bring them back to Russia. And we're going to do the same thing. Werner von Braun, for example, the famous physicist who played an important role in our aerospace industry, worked for Hitler. So the American government decides we got to get this guy and others as well. So they are brought to the United States and are eventually placed in important positions. So here again, it's the Cold War now. Our former ally is now our adversary. So we're going to use anybody we can, and that includes people whose reputation and past in Nazi Germany is something of a little bit of an embarrassment.
So it was an underground network that allowed a lot of those folks to escape.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
As an interesting aside, I was an exchange student in Paraguay.
Oh.
My classmates distinctly remember Joseph Mengele openly practicing. He had a shingle, Joseph Mengele, MD, hanging out in the city.
Yeah, that's right. Another example of that, yeah. Paraguay, by the way, was very sort of, I won't say pro-Nazi or pro-German, but it was not a real ally of the United States. So, and the same with Argentina, by the way. The countries that welcomed German emigres. There's a large, I was going to say German-American, German-Argentinian population, and in Paraguay as well. They'd been there before the war.
Yeah. How long, just out of curiosity, how long was the wall that ran through Berlin, and how much of it is left, or is it all disassembled and all just in, frankly, pieces at this point?
I cannot give you an exact figure on the length of the wall. I don't have those figures at my fingertips. But what I can say is that they have dismantled most of the wall, and they have left a couple of pieces of it as a sort of historical monument there. So when you go to Berlin, if you ask somebody, can I see an example of the Berlin Wall, I'm sure they could direct you to that. But everything else is gone. They just simply destroyed it. Dismantled it, I should say.
I was wondering if this talk today is going to be available. Did you video it?
No, I didn't. I just put it together, put a PowerPoint slide system together at Deb's request, and it's not online.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, is that you?
Yes.
Ashley records these, and she'll post it. She just needs a couple of days to get everything put together.
Oh, okay. Good for Ashley.
She posts it on the website.
Because this would be great for the other people going on the trip, to see who weren't able to come in today.
That's great.
This is a great lecture.
I wish I would have had this before I went to Berlin myself a long time ago. That's a good point. I'll mention to Tammy that she should send the link out ahead of time so they can, anybody who did not make it today can listen to it, because I totally agree. But all of our calls today are on the site.
I enjoyed the poster about the Douglas Corporation talking about they saved Berlin.
Yes.
They built, I think it was around 10,000 C-47s. That's how most of the Americans got to Europe, to fight. To England actually, and those airplanes came back and became the workhorses for most of the airlines, the early workhorses for most of the airlines after World War II.
Civilian, right.
It's a DC-3, it's the same airplane.
Yeah.
So actually they did save them.
Sorry.
Right.
We have just a couple minutes left. Any other questions?
Yes, I have a question. What happened to the people from East Berlin that did try to escape? It seems like my memories where they were all shot. Were they arrested, or what happened?
Yes, there are a number of murders by people who tried to escape, and so I guess that set the tone. If you see your buddy or your neighbor shot when he tries to get across, you're not going to try to get across. So it was a very effective deterrent, I think. And there were a number of very sad stories of people trying to get across and getting shot. There was one I recall, I forget what year it was, when the person got into no man's land and they shot him there, killed him, and nobody was going to get the body because it's in between. Just a very sad situation for the people of East Berlin. And East Germany, they came from the rest of East Germany to get into East Berlin to go to West Berlin.
An interesting comment would be walls work, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I'm not making a political statement here about...
I'm not either. I'm just saying.
The Rio Grande, but...
Okay, well, any other comments? That's an amazing presentation.
This is fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. What a wonderful group, interesting questions, and I wish you the very best when you go to these two cities and try to see as many of those historical monuments and references as you possibly can.
Yeah, the trip is already put together, but do you have any last tips on, you did say the Checkpoint Charlie Museum, in case they have any free time, or your favorite restaurant, or whatever you want to tell us.
There's a place I used to go to called Einstein, ironically. I don't know if it was named after Albert or not, but it's in the western part of the city, and they have fabulous coffee and wonderful breakfast and so forth there. It's not a big restaurant, but whatever you find, I'm sure will be well worth your while.
All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, Bill. We really, really appreciate you taking your time to educate us. This was fabulous. Historically, like I said, I wish I would have had this before I went to Berlin myself many, many years ago.